Imagine this for a second. Weeks have passed, maybe even several months, without a single word between you. Then, out of nowhere, your phone lights up. A notification appears with one brief message from a name you thought had become part of your past. It is the same person who once left you emotionally exhausted, yet now they suddenly seem interested in stepping back into your life. Before your emotions rush in and convince you to answer, there is something extremely important you need to understand. Their message is rarely as innocent as it looks. Their return is almost never a coincidence, and the way you handle this moment can shape everything that follows. If you have ever experienced someone disappearing without explanation and then acting as though nothing happened when they came back, pay close attention. Understanding why this happens can spare you months or even years of unnecessary emotional pain and confusion. The first thing you need to realize is that their decision to contact you again is usually not driven by a sudden appreciation of your worth. They have not necessarily awakened with a deeper understanding of how they treated you. They have not suddenly become emotionally mature or transformed into a healthier person overnight. More often than not, their return is connected to something they want rather than something they have genuinely learned. What they are searching for is emotional fuel. That fuel can come in many forms. It could be your attention, your reassurance, your admiration, your emotional reactions, your compassion, your curiosity, or simply the comfort of knowing they still have a place in your life whenever they decide to return. Their silence was never an act of kindness meant to help you heal, and their reappearance should never be mistaken for proof that they have changed. Their actions are usually guided by their own emotional needs rather than concern for yours. People with these patterns often operate in predictable emotional loops that repeat themselves again and again. Their periods of silence are simply one stage of that cycle. When another source of attention no longer satisfies them, when they begin feeling ignored, when they lose influence elsewhere, or when the people around them stop providing the emotional reinforcement they crave, they often start looking backward. Instead of moving forward, they revisit people they once had an emotional hold over. This is not necessarily because they suddenly miss those individuals or regret what happened. It is because they want to find out who remains emotionally available to them. That is why their messages frequently arrive at the most unexpected moments. Sometimes they reach out just as you are finally finding peace. Sometimes they return after you have completely shifted your energy toward your own life. It can almost seem as though they somehow sense that your attachment has weakened. In reality, many people like this become highly aware of changes in emotional availability, not because they are emotionally connected, but because they constantly monitor where their influence still exists. What they usually long for is not you as a person, but the emotional role you once played in their life. They miss having easy access to your feelings. They miss the reassurance you gave them, the attention you offered so freely, and the confidence they gained from knowing they could affect your emotions whenever they wanted. This is why their return is often less about rebuilding a relationship and more about checking whether the emotional door is still open. They are quietly measuring whether they can still reach you. If you answer with excitement, they receive what they were seeking. If you reply with anger or frustration, they still gain emotional satisfaction because they know they continue to occupy space in your mind. Even a distant or casual response can reassure them that the connection has not been completely severed. To someone who thinks this way, every emotional reaction has value. Your focus, your time, and your attention become a form of emotional currency that tells them they still have influence over your world. This is exactly why they often return the moment they sense that emotional influence beginning to disappear. Their absence was never separate from the same cycle. When they vanished, it was usually because their attention had shifted to something or someone else. Perhaps another person was providing the admiration or validation they wanted. Perhaps they became absorbed in their own circumstances. Sometimes silence itself became a strategy, creating uncertainty that allowed them to maintain a sense of control. Whatever the reason, their disappearance almost always served a personal purpose. Then, when staying away no longer benefits them, they suddenly reach out again. Notice how their timing often feels strangely precise. They may contact you when you are going through a difficult period, on meaningful anniversaries, or just as you begin feeling stronger and more confident. People with these patterns frequently become uncomfortable when they sense that the emotional hold they once had is fading. Their return is usually motivated by preserving that influence rather than accepting responsibility or building a sincere emotional connection. This is also why so many people misread the situation. The message itself rarely appears aggressive or obviously manipulative. Instead, it may sound warm, thoughtful, or even filled with what seems like genuine remorse. But focusing only on the words can cause you to miss what truly matters. The real meaning often lies beneath the surface. Messages like these are rarely impulsive. More often, they are carefully timed and intentionally phrased to encourage some kind of emotional response. They are quietly observing whether they still occupy space in your emotional world. They want to know if your feelings remain active, if your curiosity still exists, and if they can still reach you psychologically. Even a simple "hey" or "how have you been" can function as a subtle test to see whether you will take responsibility for keeping the conversation alive. A sentimental memory might be used to awaken emotions you believed were behind you. Even a statement like, "I really needed someone to talk to," can quietly measure whether you are still willing to place their emotional needs ahead of the boundaries you worked so hard to build. Very little about these interactions happens by chance. People who repeatedly behave this way often develop a detailed understanding of your emotional habits over time. Every conversation teaches them something about how you respond under pressure. They notice the words that make you soften, the situations that trigger guilt, and the moments when you become more likely to forgive what should never have been repeated. They remember what encouraged you to explain yourself, seek closure, or reopen conversations that were healthier left behind. Because of this, each message becomes more than simple communication. It becomes a way of collecting information. Their objective is not always to repair the relationship. Often they simply want to discover whether they still affect you emotionally. They want to know whether you still think about them, whether their absence left lasting pain, and whether the emotional doorway remains unlocked. Even silence on your part tells them something. A quick reply may suggest emotional availability. A lengthy explanation can reveal unresolved attachment. Even anger may reassure them that they still occupy an important place in your emotional landscape. Every response, no matter how small, provides insight into whether their influence is still alive. This is why messages like these often carry meanings that go far beyond the actual words on the screen. On the surface, they may seem harmless, friendly, or even heartfelt, but beneath them, there is often an attempt to pull you back into a familiar emotional role. They may mention a memory only the two of you shared, adopt the same warm tone they once used, or suddenly sound affectionate after a long period of distance. These gestures can easily be mistaken for genuine emotional growth, but in many situations, they are simply ways of awakening old feelings and rebuilding a sense of familiarity. Their silence frequently ends when they need something again. Whether it is attention, reassurance, validation, or the comfort of knowing they can still reach you emotionally. The message becomes a way of checking whether that emotional doorway is still open. What matters most is not how deeply you feel about them, but whether they still have the ability to influence your emotional state. That is why their communication often feels so inconsistent. One moment they appear caring and sincere, and the next they become distant, unpredictable, or subtly controlling. The conversation revolves around satisfying their emotional needs rather than creating genuine honesty or mutual understanding. Once you begin recognizing this pattern, the entire situation starts to look very different. A message that once felt exciting or confusing suddenly becomes much easier to understand. When someone with these behaviors contacts you after disappearing, your first reaction becomes incredibly important because they are often paying close attention to it. They observe not only what you say, but also how you say it. They notice your timing, your tone, your level of openness, and any signs of emotional vulnerability. Your first reply tells them far more than most people realize. A quick response may suggest that you are still emotionally available. An angry message can still reassure them that they continue to occupy space in your thoughts. A response filled with sadness, longing, or emotional honesty may reveal opportunities for them to regain influence. Even replies that seem calm or polite can communicate more than intended if they contain explanations, personal feelings, or invitations to continue the conversation. Every detail becomes something they quietly evaluate as they decide how to approach you next. This is also why their return often seems carefully timed rather than accidental. They understand that unexpected contact can trigger emotions before logic has a chance to catch up. They know that memories, loneliness, unanswered questions, and lingering hope can often react faster than healthy boundaries. Instead of relying on honest communication, they frequently count on those emotional reflexes to work in their favor. When your reaction shows that they can still affect your feelings, it reinforces their belief that emotional access remains available. Another important truth is that people like this often place more value on your actions than on your words. You might tell them repeatedly that you have moved on, but if your behavior still reveals emotional investment, they are likely to trust your reactions more than your statements. The way you respond often shapes their next move. If you sound wounded, they may suddenly become compassionate. If you express anger, they may portray themselves as misunderstood or unfairly judged. If hope slips into your words, they may become warmer and more affectionate. If guilt appears, they may increase the emotional pressure. That is why remaining emotionally steady becomes one of the most powerful responses you can offer. A calm tone, a measured delay, or even choosing not to respond at all disrupts the pattern they expected. When they can no longer predict or influence your reactions, the sense of control they once relied upon begins to disappear, and the emotional script they counted on starts to fall apart. When people with these patterns return after a long period of silence, they rarely come back with hostility or confrontation. More often, they choose an approach that feels safe and familiar. Their messages may sound warm, thoughtful, nostalgic, or unexpectedly gentle. Sometimes they present themselves as overwhelmed, lonely, confused, exhausted, or emotionally vulnerable. Whether they appear comforting or fragile, both approaches often serve the same purpose. They are designed to lower your emotional defenses before you have time to think clearly. A kind tone can make you question the reasons you created distance in the first place. Expressions of vulnerability can awaken your empathy, encouraging you to focus on their struggles instead of remembering your own. While moments of vulnerability can certainly be genuine in healthy relationships, with manipulative individuals, they can also become tools for regaining emotional access. Time and distance often bring clarity, allowing painful emotions to settle and helping you recognize patterns you once overlooked. As your confidence slowly returns, they may sense that their influence is fading. That is when their communication often changes. They suddenly become more patient, more understanding, more reflective, or more emotionally expressive. This shift can make you wonder whether they have truly changed or whether the relationship deserves another chance. But lasting personal growth is measured through consistent behavior over time, not through temporary changes that appear only when they fear losing access. Their warmth often increases when they sense you pulling away. Their openness expands when reassurance is no longer freely available, and their vulnerability grows when emotional distance becomes real. They frequently remember exactly what softened your boundaries in the past, what encouraged forgiveness, and what made you stay invested during difficult moments. Those memories are not always used to rebuild trust. Many times they are used simply to reopen the connection. This is why temporary kindness should never be confused with lasting transformation. Eventually, repeated behavior always reveals the truth more clearly than carefully chosen words. When you choose not to respond after they return, an entirely different psychological process begins. Their usual pattern depends on receiving some form of emotional feedback, whether it is positive or negative. Excitement, frustration, sadness, curiosity, explanations, or even arguments all give them information they can use. Every reaction confirms that they still occupy space in your emotional world. Silence changes that completely. Without a response, the familiar emotional cycle can no longer continue as expected. Instead of providing reassurance about their influence, your silence creates uncertainty. That uncertainty often becomes uncomfortable because it removes the emotional reference point they relied on. Remaining silent is not about trying to punish anyone or prove a point. It is about protecting your emotional boundaries by refusing to reopen a connection that repeatedly disrupted your peace. Silence quietly communicates that your emotional energy is no longer available for the same unhealthy cycle. It shows that your stability no longer depends on whether they appear or disappear. This can be deeply unsettling for someone who relies on emotional influence because they no longer know where they stand in your life. More importantly, silence protects your own clarity. Even one brief conversation can awaken old habits, familiar emotions, and patterns you worked hard to leave behind. A simple reply can gradually grow into renewed attachment before you even realize it. Choosing not to engage gives your mind and nervous system the opportunity to remain calm. It creates space where healing continues uninterrupted and reminds you that you never have to justify refusing someone access to your emotional world. One of the strongest qualities of silence is that different people interpret it in completely different ways. Someone who is emotionally secure may accept your silence as a sign that you need space, that you have moved forward, or that you simply do not wish to continue the connection. They respect that choice because healthy people understand boundaries without demanding explanations. Manipulative individuals, however, often experience silence very differently. Instead of seeing it as a personal boundary, they may interpret it as losing the influence or control they once believed they had. That is why they sometimes increase their attempts to contact you, change their tone, become unusually emotional, or try new ways of attracting your attention. Ironically, these reactions often reveal far more about their true intentions than anything they actually say. If respect had always been their goal, they would accept your distance without repeatedly trying to break it. Persistence after clear silence often reflects self-interest rather than genuine care. This is why silence can expose someone's motives without confrontation or conflict. Although remaining silent can feel uncomfortable at first, it often creates the safest environment for real healing because recovery requires freedom from repeated emotional disruption. Of course, there are situations where complete silence is unrealistic. You may share children, work together, have legal obligations, or need occasional communication for practical reasons. In those circumstances, emotional neutrality becomes one of the healthiest forms of protection. Neutrality means responding calmly, briefly, and without inviting emotional intimacy. It avoids anger, emotional storytelling, unnecessary explanations, or personal vulnerability. People who depend on emotional influence pay close attention to emotional energy rather than the specific words being spoken. When your communication remains steady, respectful, and emotionally balanced, there is very little for them to manipulate. Emotional neutrality is not an act of cruelty or revenge. It is a quiet expression of self-control, emotional maturity, and the decision to protect your peace. The most important lesson to take away from all of this is that the moment someone returns is not automatically the moment they have changed. It is simply the moment they have chosen to reappear. Those two things are completely different. Many people mistake contact for transformation, but reaching out requires very little. Lasting change requires accountability, consistency, self-awareness, and a willingness to accept responsibility without expecting immediate forgiveness. Those qualities cannot be measured by one message, one apology, or one emotional conversation. They can only be measured through repeated actions over a long period of time. That is why your first responsibility is not to satisfy someone else's curiosity or emotional needs. Your first responsibility is to protect the peace you fought so hard to rebuild. Remember how much effort it took to regain your confidence, quiet your mind, and stop questioning your own reality. Do not allow one unexpected notification to erase the progress that took months or even years to achieve. Before you respond, ask yourself a simple question. Are they showing genuine, consistent change, or are they simply trying to reopen a door they once left behind? That single question can save you from repeating an entire cycle. Real healing changes the way you respond to situations like this. In the past, you may have answered immediately because you wanted clarity, closure, or reassurance. You may have believed that one more conversation would finally explain everything or bring the relationship to a healthier place. But healing teaches something different. It teaches that closure does not always come from another person's words. Sometimes closure comes from recognizing their repeated behavior and deciding that you no longer need another explanation. When patterns repeat often enough, they become the answer. You stop searching for hidden meanings behind every message because you begin trusting what their actions have consistently shown you. You realize that protecting your emotional well-being is more important than satisfying your curiosity. That shift is incredibly powerful because it means your decisions are no longer controlled by hope, fear, guilt, or loneliness. They are guided by self-respect. And once self-respect becomes stronger than emotional attachment, unhealthy cycles begin losing their power over you. It is also important to remember that not every person who returns has harmful intentions. People are capable of making mistakes, growing, and becoming healthier over time. Genuine change is absolutely possible, but authentic growth always reveals itself through patience, consistency, accountability, and respect for boundaries. Someone who has truly changed does not pressure you for immediate access. They do not become frustrated when trust takes time to rebuild. They understand that healing cannot be rushed and that forgiveness is never something they are entitled to receive. Most importantly, they respect your boundaries even if those boundaries mean they never regain a place in your life. That is the difference between someone seeking reconciliation and someone seeking renewed control. One respects your freedom to choose, the other simply wants to know whether they can still influence your emotions. Understanding this difference allows you to evaluate people based on their long-term behavior rather than the emotions their return temporarily awakens. Your greatest strength is not found in delivering the perfect response or proving that you have moved on. It is found in your ability to pause before reacting. That pause creates space for wisdom instead of impulse. It allows you to ask whether this interaction supports your healing or threatens it. It reminds you that every response is a choice, not an obligation. You do not owe emotional access to someone simply because they decided to return. You do not owe explanations to someone who repeatedly ignored your feelings. And you certainly do not owe another opportunity to someone who has never shown lasting respect for your peace. Healthy relationships are built on trust, consistency, empathy, and mutual responsibility. They are not built on emotional uncertainty, repeated disappearances, or carefully timed reappearances that leave you questioning your own judgment. The people who truly value you will never make you feel as though your emotional security depends on guessing their intentions. If this message resonates with your experience, let it serve as a reminder that your peace is worth protecting. Every healthy boundary you create is an investment in your future. Every moment you choose clarity over confusion strengthens your emotional resilience. Every decision to prioritize your well-being over someone else's temporary attention moves you further away from old patterns and closer to the life you deserve. You cannot control who decides to return, but you can always control who is allowed to remain. You cannot stop someone from sending a message, but you can decide whether that message deserves a place in your heart or simply belongs in your past. The greatest victory is not making someone regret losing you. The greatest victory is reaching a point where your happiness, confidence, and inner peace are no longer dependent on whether they come back at all. When you value yourself enough to protect your emotional world, manipulative cycles lose their influence, unhealthy relationships lose their grip, and your future is no longer written by someone else's choices. It is written by your own courage, your own boundaries, and your unwavering commitment to a life built on genuine respect, emotional safety, and lasting peace.